Did Dad really leave everything to Laura? I asked quietly, still holding the printed copy of the will in my hands. The words looked the same every time I read them, but they made less sense with each passing second. According to the document, my father had left his entire estate, every dollar, every asset, every inch of the family property, to my older sister. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, the kind of place where serious conversations always seem to happen. I sat across from attorney Michael Grant at a polished oak table, while Laura stood near the window, her arms folded loosely, watching the city traffic 20 floors below as if none of this had anything to do with her. My name appeared nowhere in the will. Not in the inheritance section. Not in a note. Not even in a single line acknowledging that I existed. I had come into that office expecting something simple and fair. My father, Daniel Hayes, had always believed in fairness. He used to say it over Sunday dinners in the old ranch house outside Columbus, Ohio. Family only works when people treat each other right. I could still hear his voice in my head, calm and steady, the way it had been my entire life. But now those words felt distant, like they belonged to someone else's story. The will Michael had just read aloud said that Laura Hayes would receive the entire estate, including the house, the investment accounts, and the farmland our family had owned for 3 generations. I glanced toward my sister. She finally turned from the window and gave a small, polite smile, the kind people use when they're pretending something is perfectly normal. Laura had always been confident, always composed, the kind of person who walked into a room and expected the world to rearrange itself around her. Growing up, she had been the older sister who made the rules and assumed everyone else would follow them. But this felt different. My father had promised me, more than once, that things would be shared equally. Not because of money, because it was the right thing to do. Are you sure there isn't some kind of mistake? I asked, my voice calmer than I expected. Michael Grant adjusted his glasses and looked down at the file in front of him. This is the document that was officially filed and notarized, he said carefully. His tone was professional, but something about the way he paused before each sentence made my stomach tighten. Laura walked over and rested her hand lightly on the back of the chair beside me. Margaret, she said softly, Dad probably just thought it made more sense this way. I looked up at her, searching her face for something. Anything that resembled the sister I remembered from childhood summers when we used to run barefoot across the fields behind the house. But her expression remained smooth and distant. I nodded slowly, folding the will in half. Outside the window, the late afternoon sun stretched across the city skyline, painting the buildings in warm gold. Everything looked peaceful from up here. But somewhere deep inside me, a quiet thought began to form, small but impossible to ignore. Because the man who raised me, the man who taught me what fairness meant, would never have written a will like this. I drove home from the lawyer's office in silence, the folded copy of the will resting on the passenger seat beside me like it weighed 100 pounds. The late afternoon traffic moved slowly along the highway outside Columbus, and the radio murmured softly in the background, but I barely noticed any of it. My mind kept replaying the same moment over and over again, the calm voice of attorney Michael Grant reading the document, the quiet confidence in Laura's posture, and the strange emptiness where my name should have been. By the time I reached my small house on Maplewood Drive, the sky had begun to dim into the soft blue of early evening. I sat in the driveway for a long moment before turning off the engine. This house had never been fancy. A single story with white siding and a small front porch, built in the late 1970s, but it had always felt comfortable to me. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar smell of coffee and the ticking of the old wall clock above the kitchen counter. Everything was exactly where I had left it that morning, which somehow made the silence feel heavier. I set the folded will on the kitchen table and stood there looking at it. My father had always been a careful man, the kind who double-checked paperwork and kept every important document neatly organized in labeled folders. Growing up, Laura and I used to tease him about it. He kept tax records going back 20 years and even had a small safe in the study where he stored important papers. He believed in preparation. He believed in order. And most of all, He believed in fairness between his daughters. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down slowly. The chair creaked under my weight, a familiar sound that usually made the house feel lived in. Tonight it only reminded me how quiet everything had become since Dad passed away 3 months earlier. I remember the last conversation we had on the phone a few weeks before he died. His voice had been tired but warm, the way it always sounded when he was trying to reassure me. He had mentioned meeting with a lawyer again, saying he wanted to make sure everything was arranged properly so that Laura and I would not have to deal with confusion later. At the time I had not thought much about it. Dad had always handled his affairs responsibly. But now that memory settled into my mind like a puzzle piece that did not quite fit with the picture I had seen earlier that afternoon. If he had met with a lawyer recently, why would the will leave everything to Laura alone? The thought lingered quietly in the room while the clock ticked on the wall and the evening light faded through the kitchen window. I reached for the document again and unfolded it carefully, reading the same lines for the 3rd time that night. The legal language was clear and formal, signed and notarized months before Dad passed away. On the surface, it looked legitimate. But the more I stared at the paper, the more a quiet uneasiness began to grow in the back of my mind. Because the father I had known my entire life would never have written something that left one daughter with everything and the other with nothing. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, long before the sun had fully risen above the rooftops of Maplewood Drive. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the kitchen clock that had belonged to my parents for more than 30 years. I made coffee the way my father always did, strong and simple, and carried the mug to the small dining table, where the will still rested exactly where I had left it the night before. The paper looked harmless, lying there under the morning light, but something about it continued to feel wrong. I sat down and read it again slowly, line by line, trying to notice details I might have missed before. The language was formal, written in the precise tone lawyers use when they want every word to sound final. My father's name appeared clearly at the top of the page. The date was there. The signatures were there. And yet the absence of my name continued to echo louder than any sentence on the page. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, letting memories of my father drift through my mind. Daniel Hayes had never been a dramatic man. He was steady, practical, the kind of person who believed problems could be solved with patience and common sense. When Laura and I were children, he used to sit us down at the kitchen table whenever we argued about something and explain that fairness mattered more than winning. He believed families worked best when everyone felt respected. Those lessons had shaped the way I saw the world for the rest of my life. That was why this document felt so impossible to accept. My phone buzzed on the table, pulling me back to the present. A text message from Laura appeared on the screen. She had written only a short sentence asking if I had made it home safely after the meeting. I stared at the message for several seconds before setting the phone back down without answering. The polite tone of her words did not match the quiet confidence I had seen in her eyes yesterday afternoon. Laura had not looked surprised when the will was read. She had looked prepared. That thought lingered as I stood up and walked toward the kitchen window. Outside, the street was beginning to come alive with the slow rhythm of a weekday morning. A school bus rolled past the corner. A neighbor walked his dog along the sidewalk. Everything in the neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always had. But inside my mind a question continued to grow louder with every passing minute. I walked back to the table and picked up the will once more, running my fingers along the edge of the paper. My father had told me only a few weeks before he died that he wanted everything arranged properly so that there would be no confusion after he was gone. Those had been his exact words.
No confusión.
Yet the only thing I felt now was confusion. I folded the document carefully and placed it back on the table, staring at it for a long moment. Because if there was one thing I knew about Daniel Hayes, it was that he never left unfinished business behind. And the more I thought about that, the more it began to feel like something important was still missing from the story. Later that afternoon, I found myself driving out toward the old ranch house where my father had lived for more than 40 years. The gravel road that led to the property crunched beneath my tires exactly the same way it had since I was a child. The house sat at the edge of a wide stretch of farmland, surrounded by oak trees that were just beginning to turn golden in the early fall sunlight. I parked beside the familiar wooden fence and stepped out of the car, taking a slow breath of the cool country air. For a moment, I simply stood there looking at the house. The white paint had faded a little over the years, but the place still felt solid and dependable, just like the man who had built his life here. After the funeral, Laura had insisted that we wait before sorting through Dad's belongings, saying everything could be handled later through the estate. At the time I had agreed because grief makes simple decisions feel heavy. But now, standing in the quiet yard, the memory of those words felt different. I walked up the front steps and unlocked the door with the spare key Dad always kept hidden in the old metal toolbox on the porch. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar wood and the aftershave he had used every morning for as long as I could remember. The living room looked exactly the way it had the last time I visited. His armchair still faced the window. A folded newspaper rested on the side table beside it. For a moment the silence felt almost peaceful. I moved slowly through the house, touching the back of a chair here, straightening a picture frame there, the way people do when they're trying to feel close to someone who is no longer there. Eventually, I stepped into the small study at the end of the hallway. This had always been Dad's favorite room. Shelves filled with carefully labeled folders lined the walls, and the old wooden desk sat near the window where the afternoon light fell across the surface. I sat down in the chair behind the desk and looked around. My father believed that paperwork should never be messy. Everything had its place. Insurance documents were kept in one cabinet, property records in another. Even small receipts were filed neatly by year. That habit was one of the reasons something about the will continued to bother me. A man this careful did not usually leave behind confusion. I opened one of the desk drawers and found several folders stacked inside, each labeled in my father's steady handwriting. Bank records, property taxes, medical insurance. Everything appeared organized exactly the way I expected. Yet as I continued looking through the drawers, one small detail caught my attention. The legal folder where Dad usually kept estate paperwork was thinner than I remembered. I held it in my hands for a moment, slowly flipping through the documents inside. Most of the pages were old records from years ago, but the most recent paperwork ended months before the date printed on the will that had been read yesterday. I leaned back slightly in the chair, staring at the empty space inside the folder where a newer document should have been. Outside the study window, the wind moved gently through the trees, and the quiet rustle of leaves filled the room. In that moment, a single thought settled firmly in my mind. If my father had updated his will recently, then the place he would have stored a copy was right here in this desk. And the fact that it was not here anymore began to feel less like coincidence and more like the first sign that something in the story had been quietly moved out of sight. I remained seated in my father's chair for several minutes, the thin legal folder resting quietly in my hands. The more I thought about it, the more the empty space inside that folder began to feel important. My father had always been consistent about where he kept important paperwork. If he created a new document, especially something as serious as a will, he would have placed a copy here in this exact drawer. That had been his habit for decades. I slowly placed the folder back inside the drawer and closed it, then stood up and walked toward the window. Outside, the late afternoon sunlight stretched across the open fields behind the house, turning the tall grass a soft shade of gold. For a moment, I watched the wind move across the land the way my father used to watch it when he sat at this same desk. He often said the land told its own quiet stories if you took the time to pay attention. I thought about that while I looked around the study again. Every shelf and cabinet in this room reflected the way he lived his life. Careful, organized, thoughtful. Nothing here suggested the kind of sudden decision that would leave one daughter with everything and the other with nothing. I walked over to the small metal safe that stood against the wall beside the bookshelf. It had been there as long as I could remember. When Laura and I were children, Dad used to joke that the safe held secret treasure, but when we grew older he explained that it was simply where he kept backup copies of important records. I knelt down and gently ran my hand along the cool surface of the safe door. The lock was closed, exactly the way he always kept it. I knew the combination because he had once written it down for me years ago when he was traveling and wanted someone he trusted to have access in case of an emergency. For a moment I hesitated. Opening it felt strangely personal, almost like stepping into a private conversation he had never expected anyone else to hear. But the uneasy feeling in my chest pushed me forward. I carefully turned the dial and listened for the soft click that meant the lock had released. The door opened slowly, revealing several neatly stacked envelopes inside. Property deeds, insurance papers, copies of old financial statements. Everything arranged with the same careful attention he applied to every part of his life. I lifted each envelope one by one, checking the labels written in his familiar handwriting. Most of the documents were several years old, but near the back of the safe I noticed something that made me pause. There was a small empty space between two folders, just wide enough for a thin envelope that was no longer there. I stared at that gap for a long moment, my mind quietly putting together pieces of information I had not fully understood before. If my father had recently updated something important, this safe would have been the safest place for him to keep a copy. And the fact that one envelope appeared to be missing from that exact space made the silence in the study feel suddenly heavier. Because if something had once been stored there and was now gone, it meant someone had already been inside this room after my father passed away. I stood there beside the open safe for a long moment, staring at the empty space where an envelope had clearly once been. The quiet of the study felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the room itself was holding a secret that had not yet been spoken aloud. My father had trusted order more than anything. Every document in this safe had a purpose and a place, and nothing was ever removed without reason. I slowly closed the safe door and sat down again in the chair behind his desk, trying to organize the thoughts moving through my mind. Someone had been here after my father passed away. That was the only explanation that made sense. The question was who? The answer appeared almost immediately, though I did not want to say it out loud even to myself. Laura had handled most of the arrangements after the funeral. She had insisted that the paperwork would be easier if she coordinated with the attorney directly. At the time I had been grateful for her help because grief makes practical decisions feel overwhelming. But now those memories returned with a different weight. I leaned forward and opened the desk drawer again, looking once more at the legal folder where my father normally stored copies of estate documents. The absence of recent paperwork was impossible to ignore. If there had been a newer version of his will, it would have been kept here or inside the safe. My father would never have left something that important unrecorded. I rested my hands on the desk and looked around the study again, noticing details that had not seemed important before. A pen lay neatly beside the telephone. A small notepad rested near the corner of the desk, filled with the familiar handwriting I had known my entire life. My father had always written down reminders and appointments so that nothing would be forgotten. I reached for the notepad and began flipping slowly through the pages. Most of the notes were simple things. Phone numbers, grocery reminders, a date marked for a routine medical appointment. But about halfway through the pad, I noticed something different written near the edge of one page. It was a short note with a name and a date beside it. Michael Grant, the same attorney who had read the will yesterday afternoon. Beneath the name, my father had written the words review documents and the date from 3 weeks before he died. I stared at that line for several seconds, feeling the quiet certainty in my mind begin to grow stronger. If my father had met with Michael Grant that recently to review his documents, then the will read in that office yesterday should have reflected whatever changes they discussed. Yet the document we had heard contained none of the fairness he had always promised. I set the notepad down carefully and leaned back in the chair, listening to the soft sound of the wind moving through the trees outside the window. The pieces of the story were beginning to shift into a shape that made far more sense than the version I had been shown. And for the first time since leaving the lawyer's office, I realized that the only way to understand what had really happened was to ask the one person who had been there when my father reviewed those documents. I drove back to Columbus just as the sun was beginning to lower behind the fields, the quiet country roads stretching ahead of me in long golden lines. The note I had found in my father's study remained clear in my mind. Michael Grant. Review documents. 3 weeks before Dad passed away. That small line of handwriting felt like the first real clue I had seen since the will had been read. By the time I reached the city, the evening traffic had begun to build along the main streets, but I did not go home. Instead, I turned the car toward the downtown office building where Michael Grant worked. The tall glass tower looked calm and professional in the fading light, the kind of place where every floor held quiet conversations about contracts, businesses, and family estates. I parked along the curb and sat for a moment before stepping out of the car. Part of me wondered if I was overthinking everything, but the memory of the empty space inside my father's safe returned again. Someone had removed something from that house, and I could not ignore that feeling anymore. Inside the lobby, the air was cool and quiet. The receptionist recognized me from the previous afternoon and gave a polite nod as I approached the desk. I asked if Mr. Grant might still be available, and after a short phone call, she told me he was finishing paperwork but could see me for a few minutes. The elevator ride to the 20th floor felt longer than it should have. When the doors opened, the hallway was nearly empty except for the soft glow of office lights and the distant sound of someone typing in another room. Michael Grant was standing near his desk when I stepped into his office. He looked slightly surprised to see me again so soon, but he greeted me kindly and motioned for me to sit down. I placed my purse on the chair beside me and tried to organize my thoughts before speaking. I told him that earlier that day I had visited my father's house and looked through the study where Dad kept his documents. I explained about the legal folder that contained only older paperwork and the safe that appeared to be missing an envelope. As I spoke, I watched Mr. Grant carefully. His expression remained professional, but there was a moment when his brow tightened slightly, as though he had just remembered something important. Then I mentioned the note I had found on my father's desk pad with his name written beside the words "Review Documents." The room became very quiet after that. Michael Grant leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together, looking at me with a thoughtful expression that was very different from the calm confidence he had shown during the will reading. For several seconds, he did not say anything at all. Finally, he exhaled slowly and glanced toward the file cabinet behind his desk. When he looked back at me, his voice was careful, but unmistakably serious. He told me that my father had indeed visited the office 3 weeks before his death. The meeting had been specifically scheduled to review and update several legal documents related to his estate. Hearing those words made my heart begin to beat a little faster. Because if my father had updated his documents that recently, then the will that had been read yesterday should not have been the final version at all. Michael Grant remained silent for several seconds after telling me that my father had visited the office 3 weeks before his death. The quiet in the room felt heavier than before, the kind of silence that happens when someone realizes a piece of information may change everything. I watched him carefully as he stood up from behind his desk and walked toward the tall file cabinet against the wall. The soft metallic sound of the drawer sliding open echoed through the office, while he searched through several neatly arranged folders. My hands rested quietly in my lap, but my mind felt sharp and alert in a way it had not since the moment the will had been read the previous afternoon. After a short moment, he pulled out a thin folder and returned to his desk. He sat down slowly and opened the file, scanning the papers inside with a serious expression. Finally, he looked up at me again. His voice was calm, but there was a clear change in his tone now. He explained that during the meeting 3 weeks earlier, my father had requested several updates to his estate documents. According to the notes in the file, one of those changes involved preparing a revised version of his will. Hearing that confirmation made the quiet suspicion that had been growing inside me feel suddenly real. I asked him whether that revised document had been finalized. Mr. Grant nodded slowly and explained that the updated will had indeed been completed during that meeting. My father had reviewed every page carefully before signing it in the presence of 2 witnesses, exactly the way the law required. For a moment, I felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion. Relief because the father I knew would never have written a will that erased one of his daughters completely. Confusion because the document read in the office yesterday clearly did not reflect those changes. I leaned forward slightly and asked the question that had been forming in my mind since the moment he mentioned the revised will. If a new version had been signed, where was it now? Michael Grant paused again before answering. He explained that as part of the process, a certified copy of the signed will had been given directly to my father during the meeting. Another copy had been stored in the firm's internal records, but the physical original had been placed inside a sealed envelope that my father insisted on taking home with him that same day. I felt the quiet realization settle into place immediately. That envelope would have been exactly the kind of document my father would keep inside the safe in his study. The same safe where I had found an empty space earlier that afternoon. I told Mr. Grant about the missing envelope in the safe and watched his expression carefully as the meaning of that detail became clear to him as well. He closed the folder slowly and rested his hands on the desk. The calm professionalism he had shown before was still there, but now there was something else behind it. Concern. Because if the revised will had once been placed inside my father's safe and that envelope was now gone, then the version that had been read yesterday might not have been the final document at all. Michael Grant closed the folder slowly, and the quiet sound of paper settling on the desk seemed louder than anything else in the room. For a moment neither of us spoke. The meaning of what we had just discussed hung in the air between us, clear and unavoidable. If my father had signed a revised will 3 weeks before his death and taken the original home with him, then the envelope that once sat inside the safe in his study should have contained that document. The same safe where I had seen the empty space earlier that afternoon. Michael Grant leaned forward slightly and rested his hands together on the desk. His voice was steady, but far more serious than it had been during the reading of the will the previous day. He explained that if a newer version of a will existed, then that document would legally replace the older one entirely. In other words, the paper we had heard read in his office might not represent my father's final wishes at all. Hearing those words felt like a quiet shift in the entire story. The confusion that had surrounded everything since yesterday suddenly began to settle into a clearer shape. I told him again about the safe and about the missing envelope, describing the empty space where something had clearly been removed. Michael listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. After a moment, he stood up and walked toward the large window behind his desk, looking out across the city's skyline while he considered the situation. When he turned back to face me, there was a new firmness in his voice. He said that if a signed revision truly existed, the law required that it be acknowledged once discovered, even if the original document had temporarily gone missing. He opened the file again and carefully reviewed the notes from the meeting with my father 3 weeks earlier. The witnesses who had been present during the signing were listed in the record, along with the exact date and time the document had been completed. Everything about the meeting appeared properly documented. That meant the revised will had been real. The question now was where it had gone after leaving this office. I sat quietly while that thought settled into place. In the calm silence of the room, one memory returned clearly to my mind. After the funeral, Laura had visited my father's house alone one afternoon to gather what she described as personal items. At the time, I had not questioned it, but now that memory felt different. The safe had been closed when I opened it earlier that day, but the empty space inside suggested someone had accessed it before I arrived. Michael Grant walked back to the desk and met my eyes with a steady look. He said that the next step would be to formally review the firm's internal copy of the revised document and begin the legal process required to verify it. If the contents matched the notes from the meeting, then my father's most recent instructions would still carry legal authority. For the first time since the moment the will had been read, I felt a calm sense of certainty settle over me. Because the man who had raised me believed deeply in fairness, and the quiet evidence now beginning to surface suggested that his true intentions had not disappeared at all. They had simply been waiting for someone to look closely enough to find them.